The fog rolls in from Boston Harbor just before dawn, thick and salt-heavy, wrapping itself around the columned portico of a mansion that has stood here for 223 years. Harborfield House. 3 stories of federal-style grandeur perched on a granite cliff, its windows dark, its gardens wild with rosa rugosa and beach plum. From this exact spot, 5 generations of the Ashworth family watched ships come and go. Their ships, carrying tea from Canton, rum from the Caribbean, timber from Maine, cotton from Charleston. This house wasn't just a home. It was the nerve center of an empire built on tide and wind and ambition so fierce it reshaped the American coastline. But walk these halls today and you'll feel something else beneath the grandeur, a heaviness, the kind that settles into old wood and plaster after too many secrets, too many losses, too much power concentrated in too few hands. Because Harborfield House tells a story America doesn't always want to hear, about how fortunes were made, who paid the price, and what happens when the winds that filled your sails suddenly shift direction. Before we go any further, if you love deep dive history that goes beyond the surface, subscribe to Empire Manners. We bring you the untold stories behind America's most fascinating estates, and your support keeps these long-form investigations alive. This is the entire story of Harborfield House. Every chapter, every generation, every rise and every fall. Boston, 1802. The young republic is barely 26 years old, still finding its footing in a world dominated by European empires. The Revolutionary War is a living memory. Men with musket scars still walk the streets, telling stories in taverns about Bunker Hill and Yorktown. But the war is over, and a new war has begun. The war for wealth, for trade routes, for dominance in the merchant class that's emerging along the Atlantic seaboard. This is when Jonathan Ashworth arrives in Boston. 29 years old, born in Salem to a family of modest means. His father was a carpenter who built fishing boats. Jonathan has spent the last 11 years at sea, first as a deckhand on cod fishing vessels, then as a navigator on merchant ships trading with the West Indies. He's learned to read the stars, to sense a storm 3 days out, to speak broken Cantonese and passable Spanish. More importantly, he's learned how money moves, how a cargo of sugar bought in Barbados can be sold in Boston for 3 times the price, how British tariffs can be avoided with the right paperwork and the right harbor masters, how a man with nerves and a tight-run crew can turn one successful voyage into 5. Jonathan has saved almost everything he's earned. While other sailors spent their wages on rum and women in port towns, he kept a ledger, invested in small cargo shares, cultivated relationships with ship captains and merchants. Now, in 1802, he has enough capital to do something dangerous: buy his own ship. The vessel is a 2-masted brigantine called the Providence Star, purchased at auction after its previous owner, an older merchant named Elias Crane, died of yellow fever in Jamaica. The ship needs work. New rigging, fresh oakum in the seams, a complete overhaul of the galley. Jonathan spends 3 months in the Boston shipyards, working alongside the carpenters and sailmakers, sleeping in a rented room that costs him 4 cents a night. He's there when the sun rises over the harbor, checking every plank, every rope, every barrel of pitch. His hands blister and bleed. He doesn't care. This ship is his future. The Providence Star's maiden voyage under Ashworth command departed Boston Harbor on August 12, 1802. Destination: Canton, China, via the Cape of Good Hope cargo, ginseng root from Appalachian forests, sea otter pelts from the Pacific Northwest, Spanish silver dollars. The voyage will take 9 months if the winds are favorable, longer if they're not. It's a gamble. Pirates prowl the Indian Ocean. Storms can shred a ship to kindling in minutes. Disease can wipe out half a crew before land is sighted. But if Jonathan succeeds, if he returns with Chinese silk and tea and porcelain, he'll make more money in one voyage than his father made in a lifetime. He succeeds. The Providence Star returns to Boston in May 1803, riding low in the water, her hold packed with goods that cause a sensation on Long Wharf. Bohea tea, Nanking cloth, blue and white porcelain that catches the light like a captured sky. Jonathan sells everything within a week, making a profit of 470%. He immediately reinvests. 2 more ships, another voyage, then another. By 1806, he owned 5 vessels. By 1810, he owned 11. And in 1808, he bought the land. 7 acres on a rocky promontory 3 miles north of Boston proper, overlooking the harbor with unobstructed views from Dorchester to Charlestown. The land belongs to an old Tory family that fled to Nova Scotia during the Revolution. It's been sitting empty for decades, considered too remote, too windswept, too expensive to develop. But Jonathan sees what others don't. He sees a location where he can watch every ship entering and leaving Boston, where he can signal his captains with lanterns, where he can build a house that announces to everyone who passes by water that a new power has arrived. Construction began in spring 1809. The architect is Charles Bulfinch, the same man designing the Massachusetts State House. The style is federal: red brick, white columns, symmetrical proportions, a central cupola that serves as both ornament and observation post. Harborfield House. 4 floors if you count the cupola and the cellars. 42 rooms, a library that will eventually hold 3,000 volumes, a dining room that can seat 30 guests, service quarters in the rear wing, connected by a covered walkway so staff can move between kitchen and main house without being seen by visitors. The construction takes 3 years and costs Jonathan $23,000, an almost unimaginable sum. He pays for it in cash, in installments, as his ships continue to circle the globe. Boston society whispers. Who is this upstart from Salem? Where does his money really come from? Is he smuggling? Privateering? There are rumors he's trading opium in Canton, that he's bribing customs officials, that his ships carry more than just tea and silk. Some of the rumors are true, but in 1812, none of it matters, because the United States declares war on Britain, and suddenly Jonathan Ashworth's fleet becomes one of the most valuable assets on the eastern seaboard. The War of 1812 transforms Jonathan from a successful merchant into something close to a robber baron. With British naval vessels blockading American ports, legal trade becomes nearly impossible. Prices for foreign goods skyrocket. A pound of Chinese tea that sold for 30 cents before the war now fetches $2. Silks triple in price, coffee becomes scarce as gold. Jonathan's response is swift and ruthless. He converts 3 of his merchant ships into privateers, privately owned vessels authorized by the U.S. government to attack and seize British merchant ships. It's legal piracy, sanctioned by letters of marque issued in Washington. His fastest ship, the Eclipse, captured 6 British vessels in the first 8 months of the war, bringing their cargoes back to Boston and selling them at auction. The profits are staggering. In 1813 alone, Jonathan made more than he made in the previous 5 years combined. But privateering is only part of the strategy. Jonathan also runs the blockade. His ships slip out of Boston Harbor on moonless nights, hugging the coastline, navigating by dead reckoning through fog and darkness. They sail to neutral ports, Lisbon, Madeira, Halifax when the circumstances are right, where they trade American goods for European luxuries and Chinese imports that have been stockpiled by other merchants. Then they run the blockade again, coming back into Boston with holds full of contraband. It's dangerous work. One of Jonathan's ships, the Harbinger, is intercepted by a British frigate off Cape Cod in November 1813. The British captain orders the Harbinger to strike her colors. Jonathan's captain, a hard-faced Marblehead native named Samuel Prewitt, refuses. The British fire a warning shot. Prewitt fires back. The battle lasts 14 minutes. The Harbinger is outgunned, but she's faster. Prewitt manages to escape into a squall, losing the frigate in the rain and darkness, but not before taking a cannonball through the stern that kills 2 crew members and shatters the ship's wheel. When the Harbinger limps back into Boston, Jonathan is waiting on the dock. He inspects the damage, counts the cargo, calculates the loss. Then he pays for the funerals of the 2 dead sailors, gives their families a year's wages, and orders the ship repaired. Within 3 weeks, the Harbinger is back at sea. This is who Jonathan Ashworth is. Cold, calculating, relentless. He doesn't waste time on sentiment, but he understands loyalty. Treat your men fairly, pay them well, and they'll follow you into hell. Cheat them, and they'll sell you out to the British at the first opportunity. By the time the war ended in 1815, Jonathan Ashworth was one of the wealthiest men in New England. His fleet has grown to 14 ships. Harborfield House is complete, its rooms filled with furniture commissioned from Duncan Fife, paintings acquired from European dealers, a pianoforte imported from Vienna. The gardens are laid out in the English style. Gravel paths, boxwood hedges, a rose arbor that frames the view of the harbor. And in 1814, Jonathan married. Her name is Margaret Lowell, daughter of a prominent Boston family with roots stretching back to the Puritan settlements. She's 23 years old, educated, fluent in French, skilled at the sort of social maneuvering that Boston's old merchant families practice like a blood sport. The marriage is strategic on both sides. Jonathan gets legitimacy, entree into circles that have always viewed him as an outsider. Margaret gets wealth, a spectacular house, and a husband who's gone for 6 months at a time on business voyages, leaving her free to manage Harborfield as she sees fit. They had 5 children between 1815 and 1824, 3 sons, 2 daughters. The house fills with noise, nursemaids, tutors, music lessons, dinner parties. Margaret transforms Harborfield into a social center. She hosts charity events for Boston's orphan asylum, musicals featuring performers brought up from New York, dinners where senators and judges and shipping magnates gather in the candlelit dining room to discuss politics and money and the future of the young republic. But underneath the glittering surface, there are fractures. Jonathan is gone more than he's home. Even after he stops sailing himself, handing command of his ships over to trusted captains, he's constantly traveling to New York, Philadelphia, Washington, Portland, negotiating contracts, securing cargo, buying and selling. When he is at Harborfield, he's distant, preoccupied, spending long hours in his study with ledgers and correspondence. He's building something, always building, and the building consumes him. Margaret manages. She runs the household with the efficiency of a ship's captain, maintaining the illusion of domestic harmony for Boston society while privately struggling with loneliness and the slow realization that her husband married her for position, not love. She finds solace in her children, in her gardens, in the abolitionist meetings she begins attending in the 1830s, quietly at first, then with growing conviction, because by the 1830s, the source of Ashworth wealth was becoming harder to ignore. Cotton. That's the word that changes everything. By 1825, Jonathan Ashworth's fleet was no longer primarily engaged in the China trade. The real money is now in the triangle trade, not the old colonial triangle of rum, slaves, and molasses, but a new version. Southern cotton shipped to northern factories, finished textiles shipped to European markets, European manufactured goods shipped back to American ports. The Ashworth ships carry hundreds of thousands of bales of cotton from Charleston, Savannah, Mobile, New Orleans. Cotton picked by enslaved people on plantations Jonathan has never seen, processed in mills in Lowell and Lawrence, where workers, many of them young women from farm families, labor 14 hours a day in conditions that destroy their lungs and break their bodies. Jonathan doesn't own slaves himself. He's never set foot on a plantation, but his fortune is built on slavery as surely as if he wielded the whip personally. Margaret knows this. By 1835, she's deeply involved in Boston's abolitionist movement, attending lectures by William Lloyd Garrison, hosting meetings of the Boston Female Anti-Slavery Society at Harborfield. She and Jonathan argue about it. Fierce, bitter arguments that the servants can hear through closed doors. She wants him to divest from the cotton trade, to refuse cargoes from slave states. He tells her she doesn't understand business, doesn't understand how the world works. If he doesn't carry the cotton, someone else will. The system is bigger than one man, one company. She asks him how he sleeps at night. He stops answering. The tension nearly breaks the marriage. In 1837, Margaret took the children and left Harborfield for 6 months, staying with her sister in Salem. Jonathan doesn't go after her. He buries himself in work, expanding his operations, buying a stake in a new railroad line, investing in a textile mill in Lawrence. The money keeps coming. Margaret returns, eventually. Not because she's forgiven him, but because she has nowhere else to go. Divorce is unthinkable for a woman of her position. She has children to think about, a reputation to maintain, so she comes back to Harborfield and retreats into her own world. Her gardens, her charity work, her private correspondence with abolitionists who share her convictions, and the house grows quieter. The dinner parties become less frequent. The music stops. Jonathan Ashworth died in 1851. At the age of 78, he collapses in his study at Harborfield, surrounded by papers, a pen still in his hand. The funeral is enormous, a procession from Harborfield to Old Granary Burying Ground that includes ship's captains, merchants, politicians, business partners from 3 states. The newspapers eulogize him as a titan of commerce and an architect of Boston's prosperity. Margaret doesn't speak at the funeral. She wears black and stands silent, her face unreadable. Jonathan's will divides the shipping company and the estate among his three sons. The eldest, William, inherits the controlling share of the business and Harborfield House. He's 42 years old, groomed since childhood to take over the Ashworth empire. But William Ashworth is not his father. He has the intelligence, the education, the connections. What he lacks is hunger. He's lived his entire life in comfort, never worked a ship, never gambled everything on a single voyage. To William, the shipping business is an inheritance, not a calling. This will matter more than anyone realizes. The 1850s were a decade of transformation and gathering storms. The United States is expanding westward at a dizzying pace. California gold, Oregon territory, the annexation of Texas. The country is becoming something new, something massive and unwieldy, held together by railroads and telegraph wires and increasingly bitter arguments about slavery. William Ashworth tries to steer the family business through these changes, but he's fighting currents he doesn't fully understand. The China trade is declining, undercut by British competitors and the opening of new trade routes. The cotton trade is becoming politically toxic. Boston's abolitionist sentiment is growing stronger, and merchants who profit from Southern slavery are facing social ostracism and boycotts. William tries to diversify, investing in railroads and real estate, but his timing is consistently bad. He buys high and sells low. He trusts the wrong partners. He makes decisions based on outdated information, not realizing that the world of his father, where a man could spend months at sea and return to find his business still waiting, is gone forever. And then the war comes. The Civil War hits the Ashworth fortune like a hurricane. William's ships are caught in southern ports when hostilities break out. Seized by Confederate authorities and converted for military use, insurance companies refuse to pay, citing acts of war. 2 Ashworth vessels are sunk by Union blockade squadrons, their captains having made the catastrophic decision to run Confederate cotton through the blockade. Another ship is captured by Confederate raiders in the Atlantic and burned. William loses 7 ships in the first 18 months of the war. 7. He tries to recoup by taking government contracts, transporting troops and supplies for the Union Army. But military contracts pay a fraction of what commercial cargo paid, and the expenses are staggering. Ships are damaged and must be repaired. Crew members desert or enlist in the Army. Insurance rates quintuple. By 1863, the Ashworth Shipping Company was in serious financial trouble. William starts selling assets. Ships first, then investments, then land. He holds on to Harborfield, but the rest starts to go. The house itself becomes harder to maintain. Staff is reduced from 23 to 11 repairs are deferred. The gardens grow wild. Margaret Ashworth lives through all of this in a kind of grim satisfaction. She's 70 years old now, her health failing, but her mind is sharp. She watches her husband's fortune, built on cotton and trade with slaveholding states, collapse, and she sees the hand of justice in it. She donates what's left of her personal money to contraband camps, helping formerly enslaved people who've fled to Union lines. She writes letters to her abolitionist friends describing the poetic justice of the Ashworth decline. She died in April 1865, 1 week before Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox. Her funeral is small, attended mostly by women from her anti-slavery societies. The newspapers barely mention it. William survives the war, but the business doesn't. By 1868, the Ashworth Shipping Company was defunct. The last remaining ships are sold to a competitor. William tries to reinvent himself as a railroad investor, but he's out of his depth, competing against men like Cornelius Vanderbilt and Jay Gould, who play the game with a viciousness that makes Jonathan Ashworth look genteel by comparison. He retreats to Harborfield and essentially gives up. He's 61 years old, his fortune gone, his legacy destroyed. He spends his days in the library, reading and rereading the logbooks from his father's ships, as if he can find in those fading pages some clue to where it all went wrong. His son, Henry, watches all this with a cold, calculating eye. Henry Ashworth is a different creature entirely. Born in 1843, he's 25 when the war ends, and he has no sentimental attachment to the shipping business or the old ways of making money. He's studied at Harvard, traveled in Europe, read Darwin and Marx and the new political economists. He understands that the future belongs to industry, not trade, to manufacturing, not merchant vessels, to corporations, not family businesses. In 1870, Henry persuaded his father to mortgage Harborfield House to raise capital. William is reluctant. The house is all that's left of the Ashworth Empire, but Henry is relentless. He presents spreadsheets, profit projections, testimonials from business partners. Finally, William agrees. Henry takes the money and invests it in a shoe manufacturing company in Lynn, Massachusetts. Shoes are the future, he explains. Everyone needs shoes. The market is enormous, and the new mechanized factories can produce them at a fraction of the old cost. The company is called Bay State Footwear, and Henry buys a 40% stake. For 5 years, it looks like genius. Bay State Footwear expands rapidly, opening new factories, signing contracts with military suppliers and department stores. The stock price climbs. Henry makes money. Harborfield House gets some much-needed repairs. New roof, fresh paint, modern plumbing. And then the panic of 1873 hits. The panic starts with the collapse of J. Cook and Company, a banking firm overextended in railroad investments. The collapse triggers a chain reaction. Banks fail, businesses close, unemployment soars. The Depression lasts 6 years, the longest economic crisis in American history to that point. Bay State Footwear, overextended and overleveraged, went bankrupt in 1875. Henry loses everything he invested. More importantly, he can't make the mortgage payments on Harborfield. The bank threatens foreclosure. Henry scrambles, borrowing money from cousins, selling furniture and artwork, renting out the carriage house. He manages to hold on, barely, but the house is decaying around him. Ceilings leak, paint peels. The gardens are a wilderness. William died in 1877, a broken man. He's buried next to Margaret in the family plot at Mount Auburn Cemetery. The funeral is sparsely attended. The age of the maritime merchants is over, and everyone knows it. Henry inherits Harborfield, along with the debt. He's 34 years old, married with 3 children, living in a mansion he can't afford to maintain and can't sell for anything close to what it's worth. He takes a job managing a textile mill in Lawrence, commuting from Harborfield by train, working 12-hour days for a salary that barely covers household expenses. His wife Alice tries to maintain some semblance of normalcy for the children, but it's a losing battle. The house is too big, too old, too expensive. They close off entire wings to save on heating costs. Meals become simpler. The staff is reduced to a housekeeper, a cook, and a single maid. The silver is sold, piece by piece, to antique dealers. And yet Henry won't let go. He clings to Harborfield with a desperation that borders on obsession, as if the house itself is the last proof that the Ashworth name means something, that his family once mattered. His children grow up in a house that feels like a mausoleum, its glory days fading into memory. By 1900, Harborfield House was an anachronism. The neighborhood around it has changed. Working-class families, Italian immigrants, Irish dockworkers. The mansion on the cliff looks out of place, a relic from a vanished world. Local children tell stories about it, say it's haunted, dare each other to climb the fence and peek in the windows. Henry died in 1910. His son Edward inherits a house worth less than the debt attached to it. Edward is a clerk in a Boston law firm, solid and unimaginative, with no interest in preserving family legacies. He wants to sell Harborfield, but there are no buyers. Who wants a decaying Federal-era mansion in a working-class neighborhood, miles from downtown Boston? So Edward does something his great-grandfather would have found unthinkable. He turns Harborfield House into a boarding house. The transformation happened gradually. Between 1912 and 1915, Edward divides the upper floors into apartments, installs basic kitchens in what used to be bedrooms, rents rooms to clerks, shop girls, factory workers, and recent immigrants. The grand public rooms on the first floor, the dining room, the drawing room, the library, are closed off, locked up, left to gather dust. The people who lived at Harborfield in the 1910s and 20s have no idea what the house once was. To them, it's just cheap lodging with eccentric architecture and stunning views. A Lithuanian tailor rents a room in the southeast corner, uses the window light to do fine detail work. A widow from County Cork takes a room on the 3rd floor, hangs her laundry on a line strung between the Ionic columns of the portico. A jazz musician practices his trumpet in what used to be Margaret Ashworth's morning room, filling the house with sound Jonathan never imagined. Edward collects the rent and does minimal maintenance. The house continues to decay. The roof develops multiple leaks. The foundation settles unevenly, causing cracks in the walls. Mice nest in the walls. The gardens are paved over for tenant parking. World War I comes and goes. The 1920s arrive with their jazz and automobiles and economic boom. Edward died in 1924, and Harborfield passed to his daughter, Catherine, the first woman to inherit the house. She's 41, unmarried, working as a librarian in the Boston Public Library system. She has no money and no interest in being a landlord. She considers selling, but the market for old houses is weak. The future is apartment buildings and suburban developments, not crumbling federal mansions. Catherine keeps the boarding house running, more out of inertia than ambition. She takes a room for herself in what used to be Jonathan's study, surrounded by the built-in bookcases he commissioned in 1809. She reads there at night, unconsciously sitting in the same spot where her great-great-great-grandfather died with a pen in his hand. The Great Depression hits in 1929, and suddenly the boarding house is full. People desperate for cheap housing pack into Harborfield. Catherine rents out the old servants' quarters, the attic rooms, even a corner of the cellar to a Hungarian machinist who doesn't mind the dampness. The house is crowded, noisy, chaotic, more alive than it's been in decades, but in a way that would horrify its original inhabitants. World War II brings another transformation. The federal government needs housing for war workers flooding into Boston's defense industries. Catherine gets a visit from a housing authority official who makes her an offer: convert Harborfield into official war worker housing, and the government will pay for upgrades and guarantee rent payments. She agrees. So Harborfield House spends the war years packed with welders, shipfitters, crane operators, and women working in munitions factories. They sleep in shifts, hot bunking in rooms that once hosted senators and silk merchants. The house vibrates with their labor, their exhaustion, their provisional optimism that the war will end and something better will emerge. Catherine died in 1947, 2 years after the war ended. She has no children, and her only living relative is a cousin twice removed who lives in California and has never seen Harborfield. The house passes to him by default. He wants nothing to do with it. He hires a real estate agent in Boston and instructs them to sell it for whatever they can get. The agent tries, but post-war Boston is tearing down old houses, not preserving them. The future is modern, efficient, streamlined. Federal-era mansions are seen as outdated, expensive to heat, impossible to maintain. The agent gets a few offers, most from developers who want to demolish Harborfield and build apartments on the land. And then, in 1949, a different kind of buyer appeared: the Boston Maritime Heritage Society, a nonprofit organization founded by a group of historians, architects, and preservationists who've become alarmed at the rate Boston is demolishing its historic buildings. They've been looking for a property to save, something significant, something that tells an important story about Boston's past. Harborfield House fits perfectly. The society purchases the house and 7 acres for $15,000, a fraction of what Jonathan Ashworth spent building it. They immediately begin the work of stabilization and research. Architects assess the structural damage. Historians dig through archives, searching for documentation about the Ashworth family and their business empire. Archaeologists excavate the grounds, uncovering fragments of Chinese porcelain, Caribbean rum bottles, buttons from naval uniforms. What they discover is a perfect case study in maritime mercantile wealth. The house itself is architecturally significant, one of Charles Bulfinch's lesser-known works, but beautifully proportioned and still substantially intact. The Ashworth business records, miraculously preserved in the Massachusetts Historical Society, provide a detailed picture of early American trade networks, and the location, overlooking Boston Harbor, makes the house's purpose and meaning immediately legible to visitors. The Society spends 10 years restoring Harborfield, not returning it to its original state exactly, that would be impossible, but stabilizing the structure, repairing the damage, refurnishing the rooms with period-appropriate pieces. They paint the walls in colors analyzed from original paint layers. They restore the gardens using Margaret Ashworth's diaries, which contain detailed notes about her plantings. They install museum lighting and climate control, careful not to damage the historic fabric of the building. Harborfield House opened to the public as a museum in 1959. The opening is a modest affair: a ribbon cutting, a reception with tea and cookies, and a speech by the mayor about the importance of preserving Boston's heritage. About 100 people attend. Local newspapers cover it briefly. The early years are quiet. School groups visit on field trips. Tourists occasionally stop by. Attendance averages about 3,000 visitors per year, respectable for a small historic house museum, but not spectacular. The society struggles with funding, relying on membership dues, small grants, and the occasional request from wealthy Bostonians with an interest in history. But slowly, steadily, Harborfield finds its audience. In the 1970s, the rise of social history focused on ordinary people, not just presidents and generals, brought new interest to sites like Harborfield. Scholars begin studying the lives of maritime workers, of domestic servants, of the women who managed households like this one. Harborfield's archives became a research destination. Graduate students write dissertations about the Ashworth business records. A 1975 book about Boston's China trade features an entire chapter on Jonathan Ashworth's voyages. The 1980s bring a different kind of attention. The question of slavery and Northern complicity becomes unavoidable. Historians begin documenting how Northern merchants and manufacturers profited from slavery, how the cotton picked by enslaved people in the South was processed in Northern mills and shipped in Northern vessels. Harborfield becomes a case study in this uncomfortable truth. The museum responds by revising its interpretation. The tours change. Guides now talk about the cotton trade explicitly, about Margaret Ashworth's abolitionism, about the contradiction of a family that built its fortune on the labor of enslaved people they never met. Some visitors find this uncomfortable. A few complain, insist that the museum is being too political, but most appreciate the honesty, the complexity, the refusal to sanitize the past. The 1990s and early 2000s brought financial pressures. Museum attendance is declining nationwide as Americans shift their leisure time to other activities. Harborfield struggles. The endowment shrinks. Staff is cut. Programming is reduced. There are serious discussions about whether the society can continue operating the museum or whether they'll need to sell the property. And then, in 2008, something unexpected saves Harborfield House: television. A cable channel produces a documentary series about America's historic houses, and Harborfield is featured in an episode. The episode airs on a Sunday evening, reaching about 2 million viewers. Within days, the museum's website is overwhelmed with traffic. People want to visit. They want to know more about this mansion that tells such a complicated American story. Attendance spikes. Donations increase. The society hires additional staff, expands the tour schedule, and creates new educational programs. Harborfield becomes, improbably, a destination. Today, Harborfield House receives about 35,000 visitors annually. They come from all over: school groups from Boston suburbs, tourists from Europe and Asia, architecture students, history buffs, families looking for something educational to do on a Saturday afternoon. They park in the lot where Margaret Ashworth's rose garden once bloomed, walk up the gravel path to the portico, step through doors that have been opening and closing for 2 centuries. The tour begins in the entrance hall. The guide, usually a volunteer, often a retired teacher or history enthusiast, talks about the house's construction, about Charles Bulfinch's architectural principles, about the federal style's emphasis on proportion and restraint. Then into the dining room, with its reproduction wallpaper and long mahogany table set for dinner with blue Canton china. The guide talks about entertaining, about the social importance of meals, about who was allowed in this room and who remained invisible in the kitchen. Up the main staircase, hand on the same banister Margaret Ashworth touched 10,000 times. Into the bedrooms, Jonathan and Margaret's chamber, with its 4-poster bed and views of the harbor, the children's rooms, the guest rooms where visiting merchants and sea captains slept. The guide talks about family life, about childhood in the early republic, about the measles epidemic of 1824 that killed the Ashworths' youngest daughter at age 3. Then into the study, preserved almost exactly as it was when Jonathan died. His desk, his chair, his logbooks and ledgers under glass. The guide reads excerpts, terse entries recording voyages, profits, losses. September 4th, 1807. Providence Star arrived in Canton with full cargo, sold for £8,340 sterling. Departed October 11th with tea and silk. The numbers are staggering. The human element is absent. The guide points this out and asks visitors to think about what's missing from these records. Who loaded the ships? Who sailed them? Who picked the cotton and wove the silk? The tour ends in the cupola. Visitors climb a narrow staircase, emerge into a glass-walled room with 360-degree views. The harbor spreads below, still busy with ships. Container vessels now, cruise ships, tugboats, harbor patrol. The guide talks about how Jonathan would come up here with a telescope, watching for his vessels, signaling to captains with lanterns at night. This is where the empire was managed, from this small glass room above the treetops. And then the question the guides always ask, what does this place mean now? Because that's the real work of a site like Harborfield, not just preserving the building, but wrestling with the story it tells. The beauty and the exploitation, the ambition and the arrogance, the rise and the inevitable fall, the contradictions that are baked into American history, present in the very bricks and mortar. Some visitors leave inspired by Jonathan Ashworth's self-made success, his rise from carpenter's son to merchant prince. Others leave disturbed by the sources of that wealth, by the enslaved laborers and underpaid factory workers whose labor made the Ashworth fortune possible. Most leave with a more complicated feeling, a recognition that history doesn't fit neatly into categories of good and evil, that the past is messy and contradictory, and that the line between admiration and condemnation is often thinner than we'd like to admit. The museum continues to evolve its interpretation. In 2015, they added a new exhibition in the old service wing, focusing on the domestic workers who staffed Harborfield, the cooks, maids, laundresses, gardeners, and stable hands. Most were Irish immigrants or African-American freedmen working 12-hour days for wages that barely covered food and lodging. The exhibition includes archaeological artifacts, buttons, clay pipes, fragments of dishes from the servants' dining hall, and oral histories collected from descendants of people who worked at Harborfield in the late 19th century. In 2019, the museum launched a digital archive project, working with universities to transcribe and digitize the Ashworth business records. Researchers around the world can now access these documents, tracing the networks of trade and labor that connected Boston to Canton, Charleston, Liverpool, Havana. Graduate students in China are writing about the Chinese merchants who traded with Jonathan Ashworth. Scholars in South Carolina are tracing the cotton that moved through Ashworth ships. The history is spreading, fragmenting, being reinterpreted by people whose ancestors might have been on the other end of those transactions. The physical house continues to age. Old buildings are never finished. There's always something that needs repair: flashing, plaster, window sashes. The society runs a perpetual campaign for maintenance funds. They hold fundraisers, solicit grants, and encourage bequests. Donors can adopt a room, sponsor a conservation project. It's unglamorous work, the work of preservation. But it's necessary, because Harborfield House is more than just a museum. It's a document, a three-dimensional archive of ambition and consequence. Every visitor who walks through these rooms engages with questions that are still urgent. Where does wealth come from? What are the hidden costs of prosperity? What do we owe to the people whose labor built our world? How do we reckon with a past that's simultaneously magnificent and terrible? Night falls over Harborfield House. The last tour group has left. The doors are locked. The lights are dimmed. The building settles into its darkness, the old timbers creaking, the wind off the harbor rattling the windows. If you stand in the cupola at dusk, you can watch the city lights begin to glow. Boston stretching out in all directions, vast and complex, almost unrecognizable from the small port town Jonathan Ashworth knew. But the harbor is still there, the same harbor. The tides still rise and fall on the same granite rocks. The wind still smells of salt and distance, and the house still stands. Testimony to what one man built with ambition and ruthlessness and a gambler's nerve, and what 5 generations couldn't hold on to. History isn't a single story, it's an argument that never ends. Harborfield House is part of that argument. Evidence, witness, question. It asks us to look at how power is built and what it costs. It asks us to think about labor and luxury, about who's remembered and who's forgotten. It asks us to consider what we inherit and what we owe. The mansion on the cliff keeps its vigil. Its windows reflect the harbor lights. Its gardens, restored now but always threatening to return to wilderness, hold the memory of all the hands that worked this soil. The house is a shell that once held an empire, and now holds only questions. The most important questions we can ask about who we were, who we are, and what we're building with the choices we make today. If you love deep dive history like this that goes beyond the surface, subscribe to Empire Manners. We bring you the untold stories behind America's most fascinating estates, and your support makes this work possible. This is the story of Harborfield House, a coastal empire built on ambition. Its halls still echo with lost power, and the questions it raises will never stop asking for answers.